All right, Jason, you ready to get us started with the welcome?
I think we are just about ready to get started.
All right, whenever you want to.
Want to welcome everybody to tonight's Williams College and Association of Maryland Zoom call with Raff Donelson, class of '09. He's going to be talking with us about critical race theory and policing. I invite you to keep yourselves muted on audio throughout the evening, but drop any questions you have in the chat. And if you don't mind, please rename yourself with your class year so we know who all is on. My name is Jason Poling. I have the privilege of serving as the chair of the Maryland Association, and we've had a lot of fun, especially during COVID, doing these discussions, presentations, lectures, what have you, over Zoom. This is the last one we'll have for the spring. We're going to take a break over the summer, so we are very pleased to be finishing in high style with Dr. Donelson. So we'll start off. Raff, can you tell us about how you got to Williams in the first place?
Yeah. I knew that I wanted to move to Massachusetts. So I grew up in Pennsylvania, and at the time, Massachusetts was the only state that legalized same-sex marriage. I was an out and proud 17-year-old, and I wanted to move to Massachusetts. So I applied to a bunch of schools in Massachusetts, and Williams was obviously the best one. So that is the primary way that I got there.
And did you come to campus knowing that you wanted to be a law professor?
No. I went to college thinking that I wanted to be a lawyer, but actually during my time at Williams, I got to shadow two attorneys who did exactly what I thought I wanted to do with my life, which was work for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And they explained to me that this was a lot of work and not a lot of pay. It required a lot of travel. And I was like, oh, that's not what I want to do at all. I want to relax a little bit more. So that left me completely not knowing what I wanted to do with my life, because like that's what I thought. So I knew that I liked philosophy, and I knew that I still liked the law. So I thought maybe I'll still go to law school and figure out what happens after that.
And were you a philo major or poli-sci?
Yeah, so I double majored in philosophy and political science. Because I thought that those are things that make sense if you want to go to law school, right?
And where'd you go for law school?
Yeah, so I eventually would go to Northwestern, but my path was a little bit more convoluted than that. So after Williams, I did a master's degree, an interdisciplinary master's degree at UChicago. And the cool thing about this interdisciplinary master's is that you could kind of take courses wherever you wanted across the university. It was officially speaking housed in their division of the humanities, but as I said, you could just kind of take courses wherever. So I took courses from political scientists and philosophers out at the law school. And it was during that time that I decided that I kind of learned that what I really wanted to do was study law and philosophy still. And so I did a joint degree at Northwestern. I started that like a year after I finished at Chicago.
And evidently you got out of Chicago with a PhD in under 10 years. So how did you do that?
So I did the master's at UChicago, and then I went to Northwestern for the JD PhD. Whereas at Chicago, like you could really spend your whole life there. At Northwestern, they try to kick you out the door as soon as possible. So I finished like a JD and a PhD in 6 years. Like they were like, wow. Get out.
Wow. But and then and how'd you get from Chicago to Penn State?
Great. So after finishing the JD PhD, I applied for a bunch of jobs, mostly in law schools, and I ended up with a job at Louisiana State, which was a new adventure for me. I never really lived in the Deep South. I had visited a couple of times, but I grew up in Pittsburgh. I'd spent time at Williams and in Chicago. 8 years or so in Chicago. So this was a totally new place. And my job was teaching both in the law school and the philosophy department at LSU. And it was a fun time in many ways. One of my colleagues was Ken Levy, who's class of 91, I believe, who was in the law school. So that was really cool. He was also a philosophy undergrad. And yeah, it was a really cool thing for 3 years. But my home state came calling and I had to answer. So I just moved to Dickinson last fall.
And I guess Penn State does the grad school part with Dickinson. Is it a partnership?
Yeah. So previously Dickinson Law was an independent law school. It's actually, I think, the 5th oldest law school in the country. And they were acquired by Penn State a couple of years back. And so, yeah, so there's 2 law schools, and one of them, 2 law schools that are part of the Penn State system, Penn State Law School and Penn State Dickinson Law.
Got it. So you're sticking with football powerhouses all along, Penn State, LSU, and Williams. As Rob mentioned, this is part of the bicentennial events sponsored by the Williams Society of Alumni, not the 5th oldest, but in fact the oldest society of alumni in the United States. And we're thrilled that Raff is going to be giving us a presentation tonight. After that, we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A. I'd invite you, as we go through the chat, if you'd like to drop your questions in the chat, I will kind of field them and move them along in the discussion. But at this point, Raff, I'll invite you to share your screen, and just remind the rest of you, please keep your audio on mute throughout. Thank you.
All right. Can folks see my screen? All right. So the talk is entitled Critical Race Theory and Policing. So it's, of course, no secret that America's had a scourge of police killings of Black persons last year. In 2020, of course, the most prominent victims were George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, but that was just one year. And there are famous casualties of the police war on Black persons from prior years. Orlando Castile, Sandra Bland, Freddie Gray, Tamir Rice, and many others, frankly, who for some reason or other failed to garner the attention had by others. So the topic today is trying to explain these killings from the perspective or perspectives of critical race theory. So the agenda is probably too big for trying to fit into a short talk, but I have kind of 4 things on the agenda. So first, I'll try to talk about the scope of the problem or phenomenon to be explained. Second, we will kind of review certain kind of inadequate explanations for the phenomenon. The idea with talking about the inadequate ones is to maybe highlight CRT or critical race theory and kind of put it in kind of better relief or sharper relief. Then I'll give a kind of critical race theory quick overview. And finally, I'll offer 4 critical race theory, or at least critical race theory friendly explanations of this phenomenon. The task generally is to kind of introduce you to critical race theory and how various theorists think about the policing problem. So that'll be the task. So on our agenda, the first item is trying to kind of clarify the scope of the problem to be examined. So first I'll say that what the problem isn't. The issue isn't why some particular Black person is killed by police. Answering that, of course, will turn on all kinds of particularities of that situation. That narrow question, of course, is not our question. However, some commentators, interestingly, have tried to make that a question. With respect to Eric Gardner, shortly after he was murdered, 2 writers at the Associated Press, Tom Hayes and Colleen Long, began their article saying Eric Gardner was overweight and in poor health. Now, the problem under investigation isn't about Eric Gardner. It's about why there are so many Eric Gardners, why Blacks as a group are disproportionately the victims of police killings. Today, I ask, what explains that? The general phenomenon has nothing to do with this or that person being overweight, or this or that person looking dangerous, or this or that person having a boyfriend who happens to have been armed. The phenomenon is broader than that. So our problem is, why are Blacks disproportionately killed by police as compared to police killings of other racial groups? And to give you an idea of the size of that disproportionality, using crowdsourced data that I found in 2016 for a paper, I found that Blacks are killed at thrice the rate of whites. Now, with this kind of understanding of the problem, I want to very quickly review 3 inadequate explanations to give us a better idea about what is distinctive about the CRT approach. So here are 3 inadequate explanations. So I'll talk about them kind of pretty briefly. So first, you might mention a true fact that Blacks and, say, whites have different levels of offending. This theory has been summed up, though not endorsed, by the legal theorist Paul Butler. Butler writes, quote, if more African-American men obeyed the law, they would not have to worry about being shot by police, end quote. So some support for this kind of explanation of the disproportionate amount of killing. Some support for this is found in the fact that of those murderers whose race was known in 2018, 55% of them were Black, while just 42% were white. So a majority of murderers, when race is known, that being a big caveat, perhaps, are Black. So wouldn't that explain then why Blacks are getting killed by police? Well, no. First, while the majority of murderers in that 2018 data set that I analyzed are Black, the vast majority of those who commit violent crimes are white. Whites also commit the majority of property crimes. And of course, you could insist that Blacks still disproportionately commit violent crimes, and that's true for the most part. But this explanation is still unsatisfying because the mere fact that someone is a murderer doesn't mean the police have to kill them. Think about Dylan Ruth, the young man who executed 9 Black people in a church in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015. He was apprehended without any violence to his person. Also, there are crimes that Blacks and whites commit at comparable rates, and yet Blacks find themselves overwhelmingly the victims of police violence. Here I allude to drug offenses. Breonna Taylor, you'll recall, was killed related to drug enforcement. So, so we'll just kind of cross that first one off as an inadequate explanation about what really explains this disproportionate amount of killing. Now, a second and related explanation is that there's just kind of different levels of danger. Perhaps Blacks are just perceived as being more dangerous than members of other racial groups. And maybe psychologically there's something there. We'll actually kind of hit on that in a moment. But as a simple matter of fact, Blacks who are killed by police are more likely than those whites who are killed by police to be unarmed. It seems kind of strange that the explanation is really about perceptions of danger. A final inadequate theory is the thought that racism on the part of certain officers explains this phenomenon. Now, anecdotally, there are reports that a small cadre of bad cops are responsible for the lion's share of these incidents. For incidents in Chicago, where I lived for so long, as you know, Jason Van Dyke, who murdered 17-year-old Laquan Donald, he had more than 20 other complaints filed against him, including a judgment for excessive force to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, this kind of bad apple theory has some plausibility as explaining the disproportionate amount of killing. But as I'll explain shortly, critical race theorists don't actually buy that. For one thing, all police officers, not just white officers, kill Blacks at much, much higher rates than whites. For another thing, if the problem really is a few bad apples, why haven't they been tossed from the bushel? Something must explain why they remain. So, no bad apple here. So, let's let's kind of turn to giving a brief overview of critical race theory. Now, critical race theory is in the news lately because conservative politicians like former President Donald Trump and Idaho Governor Brett Little think, at least, that they have some opposition to critical race theory. As we'll learn, critical race theory really sees itself as opposing left of center politics, not conservatives. We'll see why in a moment. Also, the aims of things like the new Idaho law are really not targeted to what critical race theory concerns. That law proclaims that, that schools shall not teach that, quote, any sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin is inherently superior or inferior, unquote. The law also prohibits teaching that, quote, individuals by virtue of sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin are inherently responsible for actions committed in the past by other members of the same sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin, unquote. We'll find that CRT theorists dispute neither claim. And anyone who's actually read would know better, but politicians really don't have time for reading legal theory. So enough window dressing. Let's turn to this theoretical movement. I think that we can explain a lot of critical race theory by reference to two big claims. A claim about how to understand or explain legal phenomena or legal goings on, and a claim expressing a kind of pessimism about the power of law to bring about racial equality. They have a kind of pessimism that stands in opposition to the linear progress story often touted by liberals in the legal academy and elsewhere. There's that line from Martin Luther King Jr., a line often repeated by liberal former law professor President Barack Obama, that, quote, the arc of the moral universe is long but bends towards justice, unquote. It's a happy thought that the critical race folks actually deny. It's those sorts of expressions of hope that they find wanting. Digging just a little bit deeper. Critical race theorists frequently claim that we better understand legal phenomena if we first center on race. To them, race is always lurking as an important part of any story about the development of American law. So why do we have the Electoral College? The CRT folks will tell you because of race and slavery. Why has the power of the national government grown so much at the expense of the states? They'll tell you again, stuff about race and slavery. Why is the right to an attorney now a positive right when the founders definitely conceived it as a negative right? Race and Jim Crow. Why do we have modern suburbs? Race and white flight. Any major legal development, the crit type of people are going to point you to race. Why aren't there fraternities at Williams College? Similar story. So CRT theorists also think that explicit racism and explicitly held attitudes generally do very little to explain legal phenomena. They think that kind of other, as I put it, kind of less esteemed mental processes do much of the work, especially today. So look to critical race theorists to invoke things like implicit bias and other subconscious processes to explain things that go on. So that is going to explain why they think it's not the bad apples who have these explicitly held racist views that explains disproportionate killing. It's not going to be things like that. Finally, the CRT folks are kind of, as I said, pessimistic about legal change to bring about racial equality. One particular expression of this pessimism is Derek Bell's convergence thesis. The convergence thesis claims that laws meant to help minorities succeed only if they also help whites. And to see kind of what's kind of pessimistic and not so happy about this kind of claim, Bell first trotted out this theory and talking about why was Brown v. Board decided as it was. One kind of story, the kind of traditional story that people like me teach in Common Law 1 to 1Ls, is that it's the brilliant lawyering of someone like Thurgood Marshall explains why Brown v. Board was decided as it was. But Derek Bell thinks it has nothing to do with the brilliance of Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP more generally. Instead, the thought was that it somehow was helpful to stop this unproductive system of segregation, that it would, especially after the war, as the United States assumed a kind of moral superiority over its Cold War adversary, they needed to not have these embarrassing things going on in the South as they're talking about themselves as promoting equality and liberty. So they kind of needed this for kind of political posturing reasons and geopolitical reasons, having little to do, again, with the legal arguments offered by the NAACP. So this is the basic story of CRT, what they're about. What I'm going to now transition to is talking a little bit about 4 CRT or CRT friendly theories that are going to try to explain why there is this disproportionate amount of killing of Black persons. So these 4 I call the conspiratorial approach, state of nature approach, threat approach, and segregation approach. Each of these offers some explanation about what was going on. As you'll see as I talk about them, many of these people at least think of themselves pretty self-avowedly as CRT theorists. We'll see that maybe they don't fit totally within the kind of rules that I set out, but I'll try to fit them a little bit. So first, the conspiratorial approach. The most compelling versions of the story come from people like Professor Michelle Alexander, the filmmaker Ava DuVernay, and the legal theorist Paul Butler that I mentioned before. They tell a basic story that some of you may have already heard it before. The basic story is that there have been 3 successive systems of racial oppression, slavery, Jim Crow, and the current system, mass incarceration. And I call this a conspiratorial story because on all 3 of these folks, they really think that they were intentional designers of a modern system. And some of them actually even point the finger to members of the Nixon administration. A quote here from Alexander shopping her conspiratorial theory. Barred by law from invoking race explicitly, those committed to racial hierarchy were forced to search for new means of achieving their goals according to the new rule of American democracy. Here's something from Paul Butler, also with a kind of conspiratorial thought. The case is Terry v. Ohio and Virginia v. Moore, and others described below, evidence a racial project by the US Supreme Court to allow the police to control African-American men. And notice the title of the article where this comes from, the system is working the way it is supposed to. Again, this kind of conspiratorial picture. And running down below is the award-winning documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay. So why is this a CRT approach? It centers race. Now, one thing that is different about it than the kind of model that I trotted out at the beginning is it does seem to explain racially disparate outcomes like these killings by invoking particular intentional attitudes by certain actors. So someone like Butler says, the Supreme Court explicitly had certain policies that make it possible for police to encounter Blacks more often without any shielding from, say, magistrates. And this, and one of the products of that is going to be these disproportionate amounts of killings. It still fits the CRT model because it is pretty pessimistic. On these conspiratorial views, we get rid of one system of repression and it's just replaced by another. So not a happy story about what's going on. A different approach is what I like to call the state of nature approach. this, I call it that because it comes from something that I've written. I think of myself as someone who's CRT friendly, not a true believer necessarily. So the basic claim in my paper is that there's a Hobbesian state of nature between Blacks and police, at least in America. And importantly, this theory is going to predict that there's going to be disparate shootings, and it doesn't require any widespread racist ill will. So let me just do just a little bit of explaining what I mean by state of nature. So as you might have read or something like that, or heard about the Hobbesian state of nature, where things are nasty, brutish, and short. According to Hobbes, people are moved by their desires to live, but they're often beset by distrust of others when they're in a situation where there's not effective government capable of keeping the peace. When there is such things, everything will be fine, but when there's not, kind of distrust in other and desires to kind of promote your own ends will create something like war. So with that in mind, I think that between police and Blacks, there's something like this Hobbesian state of nature. There's grave distrust, and there's not an effective government that effectively quells this distrust or keeps the peace. So why is this a CRT approach? It does center race. It says that there's something between Blacks and police that where this is for, but there's kind of peace and civilization, perhaps, between police and other groups. It's also a CRT approach because it tries to explain a racially disparate outcome without having intentional states of the actors. It's not that police are motivated by racist intent. It's just that, at least in the interactions between police and Blacks, there's not an effective sovereign. And so you would predict that there would be kind of heightened levels of mistrust and violence. And in the paper where I set this out, I talk a lot about survey data, talking about how much Blacks actually mistrust police, and a lot of evidence about police mistrusting Blacks a great deal. Even distrust of Black officers by white officers. So it's CRT because it centers race, it doesn't explain by intentional states. And it's also fairly pessimistic because on the Hobbesian story, there's an escape to the state of nature possible by everyone kind of laying down their arms and deciding to give all their power to somebody else. And that will kind of walk people out of the state of nature. I don't think that this kind of story is possible. And we can talk in Q&A about why I think that. I want to talk a little bit about a different CRT approach to thinking about what explains these disproportionate killings. It's what I like to call the threat approach. This approach is kind of pioneered in an article called Interrogating Racial Violence. And the basic claim here is that stereotype threat and masculinity threat combine to make police kill Blacks, particularly Black men. How does that work? Well, first, it might help to explain a little bit about these psychological phenomena. So stereotype threat is a preoccupation with being thought that you fall into some particular stereotype, often with the result that one commits certain kinds of performance errors. To give a really brief kind of example, there's a stereotype that say women are not as good at mathematics as men are. And so when women are made aware of this stereotype, before they take a test, they do less well on mathematics tests than they otherwise would if they weren't primed and reminded of this particular stereotype about their abilities. Masculinity threat is a preoccupation with being thought insufficiently masculine, often with the result that one then overperforms masculinity. So how these two threats do anything or contribute to the disproportionate killing of Blacks? Well, how does stereotype threat contribute? Well, police, according to these authors, police are worried about appearing racist, which you might think at first would make them less likely to kill Blacks. But according to these authors, this worry about appearing racist, being the racist police officer, means that police fear that they will not be taken to be a moral authority. They'll be understood to be a racist person, and racist people typically aren't moral authorities in our world. When police don't feel like they can rely on moral authority, that makes them use physical force instead, more often, to control a situation. Second, masculinity threat. This is probably a little bit more straightforward. According to the authors, this preoccupation with being thought insufficiently masculine means that police officers, who are often males, overperform their masculinity, particularly vis-a-vis Black male citizens who are hypermasculinized. So the idea is, I have to be more of a man than him, and so I need to maybe use force more often. So why is this a CRT approach? Notice that it centers race. It says, if we're going to try to explain something, we're going to have to use, yes, these psychological phenomena, but psychological phenomena that interact importantly with race, importantly to explain what's going on. Note also that it doesn't explain these racially disparate outcomes by any intentional states by the actors. People aren't constantly, consciously thinking, I am going to overperform my masculinity, or I feel threatened and don't have moral authority. Instead, there's again something more situational and subconscious that does the explaining. And it is fairly pessimistic because though the authors, Richardson and Goff, have some proposed solutions like community policing, they actually think that these are riddled with a lot of problems. So particularly about community policing, they worry that if there was this attempt to build these, like, forge these connections between the citizenry and police to, like, make for better neighborhoods in some way or other, they worry that police will actually reach out most to majority communities with whom they already feel comfortable, and vice versa. And so that actually wouldn't solve anything. It might even exacerbate existing problems. And that's their solution. Last but not least is what I'll call the segregation approach. So this is a new approach by Michael Siegel. It's called he calls it kind of empirical critical race theory. And it's important to maybe just note in passing something that's true of many CRT folks. Often, a lot of them are trained in the humanities, and aside from the Goff and Richardson piece that I just spoke of, they're usually not creating their own data sets or doing their own social science. They might rely upon social science, as I do a little bit in my piece and other people do. They usually aren't going out and actually producing new data sets for people to analyze. And Siegel is unique in that he does so. So in his paper, the key kind of empirical finding that he has is that the level of racial segregation in an area where a shooting takes place strongly predicts the size of the Black-white disparity of police shootings. So really, in short, the more segregated Blacks are in an area, so Blacks live over here, whites live here, maybe Hispanics live here, Asians live here, Native people live here, something like that. The more segregated, the less kind of mixing between neighborhoods of the entire area, then you can predict rather strongly that there's going to be a large Black-white disparity in police shootings. So why is this a CRT approach? Again, it tries to explain this major phenomenon by centering race. We understand race first, that racial segregation is something that does something to explain. Now, interestingly, it does try to explain these disparate outcomes without calling on any intentional states by anyone. It just notes, look, there's this patterns about where people live, and that somehow gives rise to this phenomenon. But you might think that intentional thoughts might actually still play a role in the following sense. There's a pretty easy story in which one could tell about, like, what are the places that are really segregated, and then what might cause increased in a place that is really, really segregated, maybe there are already increased tensions, racial tensions, and maybe that's actually what does the explanations. Siegel doesn't really rule that out as actually the cause. And so one wonders whether this is ultimately just in areas where people are already have great racial tensions, those areas happen to have more of these racially disparate shooting patterns. That wouldn't be super surprising. I'd also say that the thing that's kind of odd about this as well is it's not particularly pessimistic, because Siegel's solution, of course, is we need to have less racial segregation, and he actually thinks that that's possible. So he's not particularly pessimistic about that. I, on the other hand, am, because patterns of residential and other kind of personal and social segregation have not much diminished actually over time. And so I'm not sure why one should be optimistic here. With that said, that's the end of my presentation. I'm not aiming to give any answers about what actually is causing these disproportionate levels of killing, but rather just to kind of give an introduction and show kind of what CRT can do to eliminate an interesting and hot button issue of our time. Thanks.
Thank you, Raff. Thank you for that stimulating presentation. I'll invite you to stop screen sharing so we can all see one another, and ask you all to turn on your video so that we can see your beautiful faces as well as the other one. And invite you to drop any questions you have in the chat. The first one that came to, and I got a little bit of an advantage because Raff sent me an article that he wrote a few years ago on this. It has been some time since I studied Hobbes' Leviathan with Jeff Weintraub. That was, in fact, the very last paper I turned in before I graduated, and I turned it in just in time to graduate. You know, that phenomenon of distrust as something that is observed, it's an observation of the fact on the ground rather than an accusation about somebody's intent. There's a sense in which that kind of an analysis lowers the temperature you know, and I think you see this in some other authors of that area as well, where these are people saying, well, this is what I see. I'm not even saying what ought to be. I'm saying this is what I see. So in light of this observation, then what do we do? You know, in the circles I run in, obviously, the temperature feels very high around this issue. So I'm curious as to whether this Hobbesian analysis has proven to be generative, has proven to create room for healthy conversations in the places where you run it up the flagpole.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I've mostly been trying to think about how, well, there's two parts of it. So one is like, if one of the major things that's driving this is distrust, community distrust, how might you solve that? How might you do that? And it strikes me that there's kind of two different kinds of approaches you could have. One is the kind of more interpersonal thing, to try to bring people together so they don't have these feelings of distrust towards one another. The other type of thing is kind of more institutional, to try to create things, to do things so that people don't see for themselves and don't actually need to rely on trust. Things like, for instance, having body cameras. So if there are body cameras, I don't have to trust the word of a police officer that such and such really happened. And the police officer can think, I have evidence that what I did was okay. The latter kind of thing is what I've spent most time thinking about, in part because, you know, lawyers think about policy and not about interpersonal relationships. And I've been somewhat uninspired by the kind of lack of creativity about how we might have policy fixes that just kind of that try to create that, or either try to create the trust or try to work around it. Things like body cameras don't seem to have had a lot of effect. There are still various task forces, federal and otherwise, that don't use them. They get turned off, data gets lost, they don't always get released when they're supposed to. And so I've been really worried that like these aren't good fixes. But I'm continuing to think about this issue, about how we can, on the policy side, kind of create the trust or create something that stands in for it.
There's a question from Sarah Baer, class of 81. She says, can you re-explain the point about Thurgood Marshall and Brown v. Board? The idea is that the Supreme Court made this decision to make us look good abroad intentionally?
Yeah. So the Derek Bell point is that instead of thinking that the court was directly responding to arguments made, say, by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, headed, of course, by the great Thurgood Marshall, that instead the court was thinking about a bunch of, as it were, non-legal factors, things not about what the Equal Protection Clause provides and whatnot, but instead thinking of things like America is pursuing this campaign where it is the moral compass of the world. But at the same time that they're saying this, like Blacks can't go to school, people are protesting in the street, churches are being bombed. Like, that's what's going on in this world. And so you kind of can't, the court was, on the Bell kind of view, the court was sensitive to this fact. Like, how can we accomplish this goal of being this nation builder, being this moral compass, winning the third world, the parts that are unallied between the first and second world? How can we do this when we have this other stuff going on? So we kind of can't continue our neo-imperialism when we have this stuff going on in our backyard. And just as a small aside, there was this campaign in Chicago a few years ago showing a bunch of Soviet propaganda from the 1950s and 60s. And a lot of the propaganda had to do with America's race problems, particularly because the Soviet Union was trying to court various African nations to kind of ally with them against America, and was using this as fodder. And so that's the kind of story that Bell wants to tell, that it was this that was really explaining, and the court was not really so much concerned with the legal arguments.
Sarah, did you want to follow up on that? You're right, you're muted, Sarah. While Sarah finds her mute button, let me drop this question from Karen Morrissey, class of 93. Oh, there you go.
I'm unmuted. I sorry about that. Okay. I need to think about it. I really need to think about all these things a little bit before I can.
Okay. All right, that's fine. Karen Morrissey, 93, asks, where do you see room for optimism? What policies can you envision that would have a positive effect?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, again, on this kind of policy side of kind of workarounds for the lack of trust, is thinking about how to make police kind of more accountable to the communities in which they serve. And so one of the things I've been thinking a lot about recently is about insurance, interestingly enough. And so police contracts are written in such a way that police are indemnified for their actions. So while Congress, over a century ago, created laws that allow people to sue police officers for violating their civil rights, most, as I said, most police departments have contracts with their cities where they're indemnified. And so that means if you do sue, for instance, Jason Van Dyke for $900,000, Jason Van Dyke doesn't have to pay you $900,000. City of Chicago pays you $900,000 and he goes about his way. And so the question is, how might we incentivize him differently? So he and people, similar people, differently. And like, I thought about, like, what if police had to carry insurance in the way that doctors do? So like, it would be a really different world, perhaps, if like anytime a doctor created malpractice, like the city just paid for it. We might see more malpractice that way, because like, what does it matter to me? But you might think like something like an insurance scheme might, like, again, set up different incentives and again works around trust. So it's not like communities would suddenly become more trusting. It's that they'd see that their incentives are different. Police are going to be concerned with not having to pay out huge amounts of money. Insurance companies are going to be trying to do whatever trainings are effective so they don't do this, or drop people from insurance. And then maybe you can't serve as a police officer if you can't be insured. That sort of thing seems interesting to me and worth exploring.
It's funny. My daughter and I were having a conversation about that just the other week. We were listening to an NPR story about a lawsuit that had settled, where there was a big payout on the part of the city. I guess the upside is, yes, if you're a cop who's not insured, there's no way you're going to be able to cough up $900,000. So if you're the victim, you're glad the city's being sued. But and I imagine if we had to have cops paying that kind of insurance, we'd probably have to pay them a lot more in salary to sustain it. So her point was cops should pay for this, and I said at the end of the day, it's always going to be taxpayers paying for it. But that's a conversation that can go on. We got a few questions here in the queue, and Darnell Usher has his hand raised. So let me throw out this question by Tom McCrae-Worrell, and then I will have Darnell ask his question. Tom says, I'm curious about your thoughts on why the Hobbesian solution of the social contract isn't available. Is it because Blacks have been structurally excluded from the social contract because that contract has been irrevocably broken? Could things like increased community involvement in providing the social services police are tasked with address that exclusion in any meaningful way, or more broadly, is broader economic justice a necessary part of any solution?
This is a really great question, and something I could talk about for a long time. So the very simple answer about why I think the Hobbesian kind of solutions aren't available are more mundane. So on the Hobbesian story, how do you get these people who are in a war of all against all to like stop? And the answer is everyone surrenders their rights essentially to self-defense. Like that's what happens in the Hobbesian story. Like everyone lays down their arms, everyone decides we're not going to do this now anymore. We're just going to vest all of this, vest all of our rights to vindication and vengeance in somebody else. And the thing is, I just don't know, functionally speaking, kind of why police would do that. And I don't know how that happens in our kind of legal culture, where we have, ready access to firearms, kind of in grave numbers. There are more firearms than people in this country. Like, I just don't know if I just don't know how that would actually happen. To be clear, I don't know how such a Hobbesian thing happens the first time.
Right.
So definitely don't see how it happens here.
Right. Well, that was one of my, I confess I don't remember well enough. I know some thinkers say this sort of thing must have happened at some point. Others say, let's posit that this did happen as a means of undergirding the justice of the system that we have now. Kind of like Rawls said, okay, imagine we could all go behind the veil of ignorance. Anyway, Darnell Usher, class of 09, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, hey, hi. It's kind of dark in here, sorry. Yeah, it's very thought-provoking. I guess the solutions that are being proposed they sound like policy proposals, right? Like tied to money. And I'm just wondering if like people still have a heart, I think in order for this country to heal, that perhaps we just need to acknowledge like what happened, right? I kind of feel like the oppression that Blacks endure today is really an attempt to like prove a point that was okay, right? That these people ultimately have no value. So yeah, I guess I'm sorry, Raff, that's not even a question for you. But it's just really, I'm just so happy to see you here tonight, I just gotta say, and the fact that you have devoted yourself to this area I'm really proud of you. So I'll stop there with the personal information, but yeah.
No, that's super kind. Darnell lived right next door to me during freshman year, in a single, and I had to have the smallest double like imaginable. It's smaller than my office right here, seriously. But be that all as it may. So like I think the only thing I guess I can kind of say in answer to your point that yeah, I am kind of thinking of policy and what about thinking about something like reconciliation. I recently super odd for me to do. I recently sought and got a position on a truth and reconciliation commission that's just been started here in my town, Carlisle, PA.
Cat's not everywhere.
And I'm like the last person who should be on such a thing, because I am, as my comments have portrayed, like skeptical about things like creating trust. I'm like, no, we need to have policies to like make people see that someone is trustworthy, as it were. But I'm trying the other way. Slightly inspired. My husband is a pastor, and he's like, no, maybe we can work on hearts and minds. And I'm like, let's join the commission and see. And so we'll see.
Dennis O'Shea, class of 77, says you haven't tried to choose a side tonight and say exactly what explains the problem of disproportionate police violence against Blacks. Given though your knowledge of how other debates on explaining serious social problems have turned out, what is your optimism/pessimism that we will eventually come to a consensus explanation, a consensus that can be acted upon?
Yeah, I actually think that we might. Actually do a bit of explaining. I tend to think also, increasingly, that like problems might be variegated. Like there might be a couple of different things that are actually doing the explaining. But I actually am pretty hopeful that like we might find some answer, that a kind of social science-based approach where we throw in a lot of different variables and kind of see what explains things with the least amount of noise. I really do think that that's like possible. Maybe I just kind of drank the Kool-Aid a little bit too much on thinking about the power of social science to deliver answers, but I really think we might find an answer. Whether I think we'll use that answer to implement something politically, but that's a different story. There I'm a lot more pessimistic.
Yeah. So a quick question from Sarah Bear. She said, you said CRT sees itself as opposing left of center, not the conservative side. It seems a bit counterintuitive. Can you elaborate?
Right. So part of it has to do with like what are conversations like in the legal academy. While the legal academy certainly has conservatives, my con law professor, worked in the Reagan White House and all those sorts of things, started the Federalist Society. I'd say a good deal of the legal academy is kind of left of center, not far left, but kind of left of center, producing people like Hillary Clinton and whatnot, and Barack Obama. And the CRT folks take the optimism, the kind of incrementalist optimism of these folks as like grist for their mill. Like this is what they're mad about. They're like, no, we're not just going to have this like linear story of progress built on the backs of like these great moral heroes from the 20th century. They think like that's, ultimately they think that that's like naive, and like that's not what's going to happen. And so they're mostly opposed to thinking that like really small policy interventions, as I said, by these kind of moral heroes is going to be like our ticket to like fixing things. They think like, no, that's not what's going on. Like that's not our problem. Our problem is much deeper than that. So that's a sense in which, so it's not like they agree with conservatives or something like that, but they just don't see themselves as even talking to them. They think that their targets are other left of center law professors and their unchecked optimism about the future.
A lot of that does have to do with trying to figure out who your audience is. I want to say I'm so glad that we've had this discussion tonight. The time has flown, and I want to thank you, Raff, for bringing us the presentation and sharing your thoughts on this. I want to thank all of you for joining tonight. This is, as I said, part of a series of events that the college is running. It's part of the bicentennial celebration for the Society of Alumni. There will be more, so stay tuned to your email for announcements from the college on what those will be. We will also, as I said, be taking a hiatus for the summer on these WCAM Zoom calls, but would encourage you to share with me your ideas for what we could be doing in the coming year, which alums you think would have something interesting to bring, whether they be like Raff on the Southern Pennsylvania fringes of the Maryland Society, or even down in DC. Well, we did do I think one joint event with the DC alumni, and also if you have any interest in helping to develop the work that we're doing with WCAM. We were kind of fairly dormant for a while, looking to get things going again. Once we're out of Zoom, in a lot of ways, this feels like we're having an interesting conversation, or we're doing just separately, and it would be great to be able to do that again, and hopefully we will be able to. But let's finish up, Raff, by just asking a few Williams questions. And since you're a professor, I'll ask you this: what one Williams class that you took would you like to go back and teach?
Yes, there's a class I took on relativism in the philosophy department by Boyana Mladenovic, and it was the hardest class I've ever taken in my life. I was swimming against the stream, but I've gone back and read everything that she assigned in that packet. And I feel like I understand a lot of it now, a lot more deeply than I did. And yeah, I think I could teach that now.
What about a class you didn't take that you wish you had?
Oh, art history. I wish I had taken art history. Big mistake. I tried to triple major, so I got to only take things in like 3 departments the entire time.
How about your favorite building on campus?
It's probably one of the libraries. I like them both. I didn't spend enough time in SCOW because I almost triple majored in three humanities, but I really liked SCOW. I thought it was a cool building, but Sawyer too.
Mm-hmm. SCOW was the science library, right?
It was, yes.
For those of us who still remember only physics, chem, and bio in a row there. And dining hall, the most important.
I ate in Dodd most of all. I lived in Dodd for 2 years. Yeah, so it was mostly Dodd.
Yeah, I had some friends who always did Dodd brunch, and the James A. Garfield Republican Club met at Dodd while I was there. So that was the only other reason that got me there. But I am thrilled again, Raff, that we were able to have this conversation. Thanks again to all of you. I hope everybody has a great summer, and I hope the next time we do this, it can be either in person or with soon hope of being able to be in person. But you all have a good night, and look forward to seeing you in a few months.